Well, welcome to this third session of the conference, and we are very pleased to have now as first paper Marcus Mølbak, and the paper will be discussed by Galo Nuño. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Marcus.
So thank you so much, and thank you for including this paper in the program. I really enjoyed the past almost 2 days, a lot of interesting conversations and people and presentations. So thanks very much for that. So this is my paper, Multiple Credit Constraints and Time-Varying Macroeconomic Dynamics. It's about the US, but I think many of the results in the paper, they are also applicable to Europe. Okay, so as I'm sure many of you in the room know, the standard way that macroeconomists would model credit control on households in macro models would be through loan-to-value constraints. So I have two prominent examples here, Kiyotaki and Moore from 97 and Jacoviello from 2005. In reality, in the US, however, households also face payment to income constraints or debt service to income constraints when they apply for mortgage loans. So a debt service to income constraint limits the debt expenses that the household can take on relative to the income of the household. So like a simple version of such an equation, of such a limit would be the equation here in the bottom. So in this paper, the overall question I ask is how this coexistence of loan-to-value constraints and debt service to income constraints, how this shapes the macroeconomy. And more specifically, I dig into these 4 questions here. So first, historically, when have LTV constraints and when have DTI constraints been the dominant constraints that would restrict mortgage borrowing? So these two constraints, they typically yield different debt limits, or there's quantities of debt that a household can take on. So when has the one constraint been the effective constraint, and when has the other constraint been the effective constraint? That's the first question. Then the second question is the role of DTI limits in causing the run-ups prior to the savings and loan crisis and prior to the Great Recession. Then the third question is, so that's on macroprudential policy, so is the credit cycle, is that best controlled by adjusting LTV limits or by adjusting DTI limits or through leaning against the wind monetary policy? And then finally, I have a question on how the switching between LTV and DTI constraints, how this switching shapes the macroeconomy. Okay, so that's the 4 issues that I will dig into. As you might have guessed, I'll mainly rely on a theoretical model, but I also have some empirical results in the end. So what I'll show you first, that's a New Keynesian dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model with 4 different regimes. So it's a regime switching model. I won't go through all the mathematical details of the model, but here's to give you an overview. So there's a patient household that lends in the model, and there's an impatient household that borrows in the model. Then there'll be long-term fixed-rate mortgage contracts in the model, and there'll be the 2 credit requirements. So there's a loan-to-value requirement, and there's a debt service requirement on a newly originated debt. Then there's Douglas goods production technology, there's housing investment in the model, and then there's an inflation process, so there's a Phillips curve, and there's a Taylor rule. So there'll be some utility functions, and there'll be some budget constraints, and we have the long-term mortgage contracts. So the reason I show you these slides here is that if you have any questions about the structure of the model, then we can always go back to it later. So I'll just pause here with the 2 credit constraints. So the way they function is they limit the newly originated debt. So that's this B prime T we have. Now there are going to be two regimes. of credit control. So there's one regime where the LTV constraint, that's the dominant control. And so in this case, so I'll refer to that as the LTV constraint is binding. But what actually goes on there is that a majority kappa LTV of the members of the inpatient household, this majority kappa LTV, they are restricted by the LTV constraint, and then the complementary minority 1 minus kappa LTV, they are restricted by the DTI requirements. And then conversely, in the DTI regime, there it's a majority 1 minus kappa DTI who are restricted by the LTV requirement, and it's a majority kappa DTI who are restricted by the DTI requirement. The LTV limit, that's going to be constant throughout the estimation period, while the DTI limit, that will be varying over time because of an exogenous shock to this DTI limit. So the shock, that's this S DTI T variable. This discrepancy, or this difference between non-shocks to the LTV and shocks to the DTI, I base that on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac data, which indicates a very strong historical stability in the LTV limit, but not in the DTI limit. It varies much more over time. And also where, like bunching, that varies over time, also on the DTI. Okay, so yeah, there's a firm that produces some goods, and then there's the Phillips curve, and there's a Taylor rule, and some market clearing conditions. Okay, so coming to parameterization. I solved the model with the piecewise linear solution method from Guerrero and Iacoviello. So there will be 4 regimes in the model. There's a regime where the loan-to-value constraint is binding. Then there's a regime where the debt service to income constraint is binding or dominant. Then there's a knife edge regime where both constraints are binding, but that's a knife edge regime. It doesn't, apply in the period. And then there's a regime where both constraints are slack. So in that case, the inpatient household is credit unconstrained. Some of the parameters are estimate, and then the other ones I estimate by Bayesian maximum likelihood. So you'll see here that there's going to be a DTI limit of 43% and a LTV limit of 82%. The sample that I estimate the model on, this is comprised of 6 variables. So we have private consumption, we have mortgage credit outstanding, then we have house prices, and we have incomes, and we have employment measured by weekly hours, and then there's a price deflation. There are also going to be 6 structural shocks. So there's an intertemporal preference shock that shifts consumption behavior. Then there's a housing preference shock that shifts housing demand. Then there's the DTI shock that I talked before that shifts the DTI limit. There's a technology shock, and there's a labor preference shock that shifts labor supply. And then there's a price markup shock that shifts price inflation. Okay, so now to the results from the model. So the first result that I get out of the model is when the 2 types of credit requirements have been dominant. From the Lagrange multipliers over the estimation period, I can see when the one constraint was binding and when the other constraint was binding. So what you see here is that one constraint has always been binding through the estimation period. So borrowers have always been credit controlled or credit restricted. We see a tendency that during and after recessions, the LTV constraint is binding, while in expansions, the DTI constraint is binding. But I'll come back to why that is the case now, on the next slide here. So what this figure shows you, that's the house prices that the model is estimated on, and then incomes that the model is estimated on. So these are detrended variables. And then the shaded areas, they indicate whether the LTV constraint binds or if the DTI constraint binds. And what you see is that in expansions, both house prices and incomes go up, but house prices increase much more than incomes in expansions. And then, on the other hand, in contractions, house prices fall more than incomes. So that relaxes the loan-to-value requirement more than it relaxes the DTI constraint in expansions. So that then unbinds the LTV constraint and causing the DTI constraint to bind. And then conversely, in recessions, house prices fall more than incomes, so that prompts the LTV constraint to bind and unbinds the DTI constraint. Then also there's something coming through from monetary policy, or countercyclical monetary policy. So if inflation goes up in an expansion, that's going to induce the central bank to raise the interest rate, and that also tightens the DTI constraint more than it tightens the LTV constraint. And then, the converse dynamics apply in recessions. So that also causes this systematic response over the business cycle. Okay, so that was the first set of results. Then the second, that's about the historical evolution in DTI limits. So we see here that there's a slowly moving DTI cycle in the model, in the estimated model. So this comes from the data, of course. So first we see that DTI limits, they rose until say the late part of the savings and loan crisis around 1990, and then they came down again. And then they came down for a long period of time, and then again in the boom in the 2000s, they started rising again up until 2009, and then they came down again. And then they have been sort of stable since after the financial crisis, since 2012. Okay, so now to the macroprudential implications of this. So as I'm sure many of you know, or probably all of you know, that there's a growing literature showing that credit expansions, and for instance not asset price expansions, they tend to predict banking crisis and housing market crisis. So based on this, or motivated by this evidence, these contributions, I examine the ability of the credit limits, or the credit requirements, and the monetary policy to stabilize the deviations of credit from its trend. So what I do is to augment the two credit constraints with macroprudential stabilizers. So there's an LTV stabilizer and there's a DTI stabilizer. So they are the blue variables on this slide. The stabilizers, they respond negatively with a unit elasticity to expected deviations of credit from the steady state value of credit. So that's the equations below. So what I do in the analysis here that I'll show you now is to calibrate the model to the posterior mode and then simulate the model with and without these counterfactual policies. So in the case that the counterfactual policies are not active, in those cases the model will per construction match the data that it was estimated on. But we can use this as a laboratory to assess counterfactuals. So I find this. So first, the black line here, that's the actual evolution of credit in the estimated model. Then if you look at the dashed red line, that's the evolution of credit only in the case of an active LTV policy. So we see that this active LTV policy is not able to prevent credit from growing in the boom years. So the red line tracks the black line in the boom years. Thanks. But then in the bust years, there's still deleveraging going on, and that's so there's less deleveraging going on in the bust years, and that's because then LTV limits are higher in the bust years. But then on the other hand, the DTI limit is able to prevent credit from growing in the boom years, and that's because the DTI limit is binding in this period. So if you want to minimize the deviations of credit from its long-run trend, then what we should do is to have a two-stringed policy where both LTV limits and DTI limits, they respond countercyclically to deviations of credit. So that's the green situation where both policies are active. So that's the stable most. Then I also look at leaning against the wind, where the interest rate is raised whenever expected credit growth is high. And there we find these policies here, or these results here. So that's the green line you should compare with the black line. In this case, credit is going to be more stable both in expansions and in recessions. And then finally, to compare the leaning against the wind policy with the loan-to-value DTI policy, so I do that here. So here I compute consumption at risk for the patient household and for the inpatient household. And what we see here is that the loan-to-value policy is able to make the consumption process for the inpatient household more stable, while that's not the case with the leaning against the wind policy. And that's because, if you think about it, what leaning against the wind does is to raise the interest rate in the situations where debt is already high, so it puts additional debt burden on the inpatient households. And then they can pay less in situations where debt are low, but they get less out of that exactly because debt is low. If policymakers have distributional concerns, then they may favor the two-stringed LTV DTI policy over the leaning against the wind policy. So what the LTV DTI policy does is to prevent the flow of funds in recessionary episodes from borrowers to savers. Okay, so then finally I have some empirical evidence on state-dependent credit elasticities. A prediction of the model, that's figure 3 in the paper, is that whenever the housing wealth to income ratio is relatively low, then a majority of the borrowers are LTV constrained. And so whenever a majority of borrowers are LTV constrained, then house price growth has a strong effect on credit growth. And then on the other hand, whenever the housing wealth to income ratio is pretty high, then a minority of borrowers are LTV constrained, instead they are DTI constrained, and so that means that the house price growth has a weak effect on credit growth. And here, if you could replace LTV with DTI, and then you could replace house price growth with income growth, and then this would still hold. Okay, so I can test this, and I test this by estimating the following second stage regression model. So here on the left-hand side, we have the log change in credit originations across US counties. And I regress that on house price growth and on income growth and some dummies. And then then I interact the house price elasticity and I interact the income elasticity with this indicator ILTV and IDTI. So ILTV is going to be 0 when house prices, when the house price to income ratio is relatively high, and it's going to be 1 when they're relatively low. So this is a way of separating the elasticities. So I have some Bartik type house price and income instruments. So essentially I exploit differences in the loading of the national house price and income cycles on local house prices and local incomes. I exploit that as a way to achieve exogenous variation at a county level. So of course I don't have exogenous variations at a national level, but I don't need that. I only need it at a county level. And then also I have for instance, the state year fixed effects. Okay, so I get these results. So I see that we're not separating the elasticities. Then I see that house price growth, that has an effect on credit growth, while incomes don't. So that's column 1. But then if you focus on column 4, for instance, in this case, house price growth only has an effect on credit, when the house price to income ratio is relatively low, so that it borrowers are LTV constrained. And then income growth only has an effect on credit growth when the house price to income ratio is relatively high, so the DTI constraint binds. So that's that's column 4 here. There's also column 3, so that depends on the detrending method. So whenever I identify when it's high or when it's low, that's based on a detrending of the level of house prices to incomes in the respective counties. Okay, so then there are some robustness results here. Okay, but then to sum up. So what I do in the paper is to build a DSG model with a loan-to-value requirement and a debt service to income requirement. I find that the LTV constraint binds in contractions and the DTI constraint binds in expansions. I also see that the DTI limit has moved around historically. So for instance, it moved from 39% in 98 to 56% in 2008 at the peak before the financial crisis. Then the countercyclical macroprudential experiments show that the DTI tool is mainly effective in expansions, while the LTV tool is effective in contractions. So you can use the DTI tool to curb credit growth and the LTV tool to support credit growth. Of course, this doesn't consider like the risk of systemic crisis. Okay, and then, the leaning against the monetary policy is also effective, but it redistributes consumption risk in an adverse way. And then some of the dynamics of the model is corroborated by county-level data. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Marcus, now let's listen to Galo's discussion.
Thank you. So, first of all, let me thank the organizers for having given me the opportunity to discuss this paper. I mean, my personal view about reading a paper is that what I look for a paper when I have to read it is that the paper is well written so that at least I can understand what happens inside and that I can learn something from the paper. And I think that in both respects, this paper has completely fulfilled my expectations because the paper is very well written, it's very easy to get all the conclusions, which is not easy in a paper that does a lot of things. So this is not a one idea paper in the sense that the paper has a model, taking to the data, has positive results, has normative results. At the end of the paper there is all this empirical analysis. So it's kind of a mix of different elements, which I mean is nice because I mean you go jumping from one section to the other and then you get a totally different glimpse to the set of results. So in that way, I like the paper. I like the paper a lot. Then the paper is quite ambitious in that respect. What does the paper do, in my view? Not entering in this last part of the empirical analysis, which I am a complete ignorant, and I feel totally unable to judge. So essentially, I mean, the paper makes a very relevant question, I mean, especially for a kind of conference like this one, which is the macroeconomic impact of loan-to-value and debt-to-income constraints. In order to analyze that, what it builds is this kind of patient, impatient, Jacobiello-style paper where you have these two kind of households and occasionally credit constraints. The novelty of this paper is that instead of, I mean, coming up with a credit constraint per se that summarize both things, I mean, most of the literature has focused on loan-to-value issues more than debt to income. So the issue here is that it comes with this linear combination, and I will talk more about that in a second, of loan-to-value and debt to incomes with changing weights. And then in order to estimate how this weight change, it goes to the data, and it let the data talk about that. The difficulty of solving a model with occasionally binding constraint is that, of course, that is a nonlinear model. And in this case, it's a nonlinear model with multiple edges. So in order to cope with that, it uses this computational toolkit developed by Luca Guerrieri and Matteo Jacobiello that allows to do this kind of linearization, multiple linearization, okay? That introduces some kind of asymmetries and state-dependent dynamics that are naturally linked to the nonlinear properties of the model. The model has many findings, but but to me the two most relevant are: the first one is that the loan-to-value constraints dominate in recessions, and that debt-to-income constraints dominate in expansions. That is, if you think about that, that is kind of, exposed as it often happens in good papers. Once that you think about that exposed, it's kind of obvious in the sense that during a recession, when house prices are going down, then it's the loan-to-value the one that is dominated, whereas in expansion, is precisely the debt-to-income the one that is, because house prices are in a boom, so it is not, the bank doesn't really care very much about the price of the house in that respect. And then the other set of results that I would like to highlight, because they were quite interesting to me, pertains to the analysis of different macroprudential rules. And then, and as a kind of a corollary of the positive results, he finds that counter-cyclical debt-to-income, that is very relevant to deal with house price booms, whereas loan-to-value for slants. So this normative result is kind of the side phase of the normative, of the positive analysis. Okay, so that about my reading of the paper. So which are my main comments? My main comment can be grouped in 4 different categories. I'm sorry because, rereading this morning my presentation, I've realized that my discussion looks a little bit like a referee report. I hope that can be at least useful for the author. But so I will separate between 3 major comments and some minor comments for the author. The first one is the credit constraint. The credit constraint is the paper, in the sense that the key novelty is in this credit constraint. The idea of the credit constraint, and I would like to highlight it, is that what the author is imposing is 2 constraints. But those 2 constraints doesn't mean that one of the constraints is a loan-to-value and the other is a debt-to-income. Both constraints include loan-to-value and debt-to-income. The difference between the 2 constraints is that in one of them, the prior in the Bayesian estimation is that loan-to-value is going to be more relevant, and in the other is that debt-to-income is going to be more relevant. Okay, so that's the first thing that should be realized. But then, there is not an easy interpretation of what this kappa being the linear ratio between one of the constraints and the other really mean, because in some parts of the paper there is maybe a subconscient analogy to the paper by Greenwald, in which there is only one constraint that includes both elements but is fully microfounded, and in that paper this kappa, the equivalent of kappa in that paper, represents the share of people who are hitting the constraint. But it is not the case in this paper. So this is not about shares of people. So it's not that easy to understand what does it mean. Then also you can say, the paper has 2 constraints, but why not 3 constraints? Or 4 constraints? Or 5 constraints? You can find that there is a third regime in which both constraints kind of hit at the same time. So that gives a certain sense of ad hoc formulation. In real time, what would be really, and I will come back to that at the end of the discussion, what would be great is to have a model with heterogeneous households that the mass of people endogenously change from one situation to the other, because, the use of this 2-agent model in which, by definition, you are a borrower or you are a lender, depending on which of these constraints, if you take let's be clear about that. If you take an Ayagari model with an exogenous, and you can, I did it, but then I decided not to present it in order not to make the discussion too long, and you just have this kind of debt-to-income constraint, and then you modify that constraint, then the whole mass of borrowers and lenders is going to be changed in that economy. Whereas in this economy, if you change the constraint, the mass of lenders remained unchanged. So that is something that made me a bit uncomfortable. Even more about that, something that made me really uncomfortable about the paper was about the macro foundations. Because, here there are 2 constraints, but those constraints, they don't come from microfoundations. I mean, at the end of the paper, there is some discussion about, under some circumstances, how the debt to income can be microfounded and the loan to value can be borrowed from Kiyotaki Moore, but this particular expression is never microfounded. And it's neither what you really observe in the real world. So what people, I mean, if you have some bank officer here and tells you what is the loan to value or debt to income constraint that they are applying to their clients, look something more like that. Not something similar to what is in the paper. So it uses the total stock of debt. So the total amount of new debt that you can access is a function of the current stock of debt, which is something different to what is in the paper. But it even matters because there is a very nice exercise done in the paper in Figure 7 in where it compares the loan to value and debt to income produced by the model with that observed using granular data. But the problem, what makes me worry about that is whether, I mean, you are comparing apples with apples, because whether the kind of coefficients that you obtain in your model can be directly compared to what you observe in the data, when the kind of constraint that you are imposing is different. Okay, so that is one block. The second is taking the model to the data. That is the nerdiest part of the discussion. The paper used Bayesian estimation, okay, for a very reasonable amount of time using an H-based filter. I mean, if Fabio Canova would be here, he could raise a lot of concerns about why HP filters really destroy the data compared to bandpass filter, and why bandpass filter is the natural way or even linear detrending here. But beyond that criticism, there is a more substantial point about that in a model with occasionally binding constraint. I mean, imagine that you have a trend in house prices that is pushing you systematically about the constraint. Then doesn't matter the fluctuations around that. I mean, you are always being constrained. If you remove that trend, what you cannot say is that in this part of the cycle, the constraint is binding, and in this other part of the cycle, the constraint is not binding, because the trend is the one that dominates the constraint. So that is something that should be, the paper should be robust to this kind of criticism. Then there is another issue about the paper has a very, very interesting discussion about monetary policy leaning against the wind. But the paper is not estimated against interest rates. I don't know why. But it would be interesting to know how do the counterfactual posterior path of interest rate look in the model, and why you didn't introduce monetary policy shocks. So from the perspective of a central bank, and this paper is very nice because the monetary policy really follows the Taylor rule and you never deviate from that. But all these things make me wonder how much can I trust the monetary policy effects and concerns. Yeah, I'm 1 minute, let me deviate 2 minutes more. About the macroprudential implications, I mean, there is very nice, but there is a philosophical question, which is, why do you want to smooth the credit cycle in this model? I mean, there is no underlying reason. There are no banks, so you should, saying, look, I can smooth consumption, but why do you want to smooth consumption in this model? Is it welfare improving? Is it at least welfare improving for the impatient household? And then what is the impact on the rest of macro variables? Because maybe you are smoothing the credit cycle, but you are increasing the volatility of inflation. So it's not clear that it is going to be positive. And then some minor issues, more about that those are totally small issues, like why the hybrid Phillips curve with backward price indexation, is it necessary for the paper? Why this kind of production function? There are some issues about the substitutability of the labor of one household with the other that maybe, I'm pretty sure that they really don't play any role for the results of the paper. But at the end of the day, then there are some references at labor supply shrinking after a positive debt to income shock, that it would be nice if you could provide some intuition. So, the punchline of my discussion is this is a very ambitious and persuasive paper. So, there are a number of lines that should be made crystal clear in order to make the paper even more persuasive. And then, as we say it in Spanish, I would like to write this Carta a los Reyes Magos. That's what kids write, this letter to the three wise men. What would be really amazing, I'm not asking to do it, but it's a very nice research proposition, was to do exactly this exercise in a kind of heterogeneous agent environment in which you can really see how people are moving around. So thank you very much.
No, thank you, Galo, and sorry for the rush. So would you like to answer?
Yeah, thanks, and thank you so much for the discussion. I think you have a lot of good points here. I also disagree with you on some of the issues, but I think you do have some good points. So just about the comparison with Greenwald. So I think the whole point here is not to have this continuous. So of course it's more consistent with how we would feel stuff works in the real world, to have a continuous kappa. But the problem is then when you solve the model, then you'll have linear or quasi-linear dynamics around the steady state. So you won't really be able to look into the effects of the different sizes of the kappa changing. And so that's where I then try to do something that's a bit between to allow for some heterogeneity, but have it switching non-linearly. So I think regarding the monetary policy, so again, this is computationally very heavy. Having another variable to estimate it, I mean, it entails some computational cost, but I mean, it's a fair point. The estimates in the Taylor rule are consistent with the estimates that both the empirical and less empirical studies have found in the past. So I'm not so worried about the dynamics itself. The intuition behind the DTI shock lowering labor is that the borrowers are not DTI constrained, so that makes them less likely to supply their labor because they don't have the DTI requirement to do so. Thanks.
Any questions from the audience?
Thank you very much. So probably it's an unfair question given the lies of the model. But I was wondering to what extent something related to misreporting could be relevant in these types of models that go through the business cycle in these two types of leverage constraints. So what do I mean? So you have these loan-to-value constraints, and there's an issue about is this the price or the imputed value by the lenders? So that could be a thing. And something similar, which probably depends on the country you're thinking about, with debt to income. Could we think that in recessions, the actual income that is reported by an individual differs from the actual, which then could have effects on that? Again, I think it's unfair on the lights of the model, but I would want to see your views on it.
So that's a really good point. I think misreporting is a part of the explanation for the rise in DTI limits that we see in the boom in the 2000s, at least and that's also where the peak over the estimation is. So what we know now from that point in time, so I should start somewhere else. These DTI limits that the model is calibrated to, they also applied for government-sponsored enterprises, so Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac back then, or at least some of them have been adjusted a bit, but I mean, broadly speaking, they also applied at that point in time. Yet they appear not to have been enforced. So I think there is at the loan origination level, a lack of enforcement historically. Yes.
One more question.
It's a bit more of a comment. I mean, one is private securitization in the early 2000s, so the debt-to-income ratios could be way different than what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac want to have, simply because you securitize it outside. The second is you may want to consider being a bit more careful about the savings and loan crisis, which centered a lot around commercial real estate, and that's really outside what you're doing in the model. So in terms of interpretation, I would just be a little bit more careful about that.
Sure.
Okay, there are no more questions. Just thanks, Marcus and Galo. And we move to the second paper. The speaker, the presenter of the paper, Karsten Müller, will be online, but Veronica will comment here. Hi, Karsten. No, we are not hearing you. We are seeing you.
You let me know when.
Now.
Yeah? Wonderful. Okay. Well, then let me just start by saying thanks so much to the organizers for including our work here. I'm really, really excited for the opportunity to present. And yeah, just want to say, just kind of underscore what Marcus was already saying, that I think, this is really a super interesting event. Also a while ago, I really enjoyed the discussion. So, congratulations to the organizers. And thanks, of course, to Veronica for agreeing to discuss our paper. Now, let me try and see if the slides here are working. I believe you can see my slides.
We don't see them properly. Rafa, they are like moved to one side. But Rafa is going to check.
Oh, good.
It must be a technical problem, not on your side.
I can also do it without slides, but that's usually not as interesting. So.
One minute. Now. Now it's fine. Oops.
I think that was another.
It's gone again. It was fine, but now it's gone again and it's blank. But it was fine 30 seconds ago.
No worries. I promise I'll do my best to keep my allotted time and to not destroy this.
You just have to wait. The problem is on our side. Can you just put exit, but exit from the session? Okay, can you just please exit the software where you are using the slides and come back? Sorry about that. No, Rafa, it's okay. Now it's fine. Thank you, Karsten.
Okay, let's try. You guys keep me in the loop if everything goes right. So, thanks again for having me. So the motivation for this project is that, especially when you look across countries, rapid expansions in private credit are often, but not always, followed by these deep economic downturns and sometimes also financial crises. But although that's something that has been well established for quite some time, there are really a couple of key questions, we think, that remain quite fundamentally unclear about how private credit interacts with the real economy. So just to mention some of the key ones that we think are important is, why is it that some of these credit booms end badly, as in with these deep recessions and crises, but others are actually linked to stable or even higher economic growth? And if that's the case, how can we tell apart these good from bad booms? And perhaps more on kind of a fundamental level, how important, if at all, is it who actually gets all that borrowed money during credit booms? What we try to do in this paper is to argue that the sectoral allocation of credit is important for understanding these linkages between credit markets, macroeconomic fluctuations, and the incidence of crises. Okay, so why are we focusing here on the allocation of credit across sectors? Our focus here is really motivated by models of credit cycles with sectoral heterogeneity. So most of the models in this literature distinguish essentially of three major sectors in the economy. On one hand, you have firms in the tradable sector. So think here of, for example, large manufacturers that can export goods abroad. You have firms in the non-tradable sector. Think here of construction firms or small restaurants, other types of local services, and you have households. And so what these models emphasize is that these sectors may differ in how sensitive they are, on one hand, with respect to credit supply shocks or financing conditions more broadly, and how sensitive they are to changes in household demand. And so what you get from those models is the prediction that lending to firms in the non-tradable sector in particular, and also households, should be systematically associated with these downturns by fueling unsustainable demand booms, by contributing to build-ups of financial fragility, and perhaps even by lowering productivity through a misallocation of resources across sectors. But if you think about perhaps some of the most prominent theories of credit cycles, those do not tend to emphasize this kind of heterogeneity on the borrower side. So for example, work that focuses on a network of financial intermediaries or behavioral factors. And so we think that whether the allocation of credit actually matters empirically is very much more in question. So to test for that, we immediately run into a major data challenge, which is really, if you look at existing data efforts, you cannot really tell who in the economy actually receives credit, at least not when you're looking across countries, because existing data sets simply don't allow for that. So just to make maybe two obvious examples, if you look at data from the Bank for International Settlements, which has been widely used, or you look at data by widely cited work by Jordan, Schuller, and Taylor, at best you can kind of differentiate how much lending goes to households and how much goes to firms. And even there are at times kind of limited in the number of countries. And so to make progress here, the backbone of this project is a new cross-country panel database that we think is quite a departure from this work. So what we did here is essentially go back to the raw data, the original paper publications in most cases, published by central banks, financial regulators, etc. And what we can measure is how much outstanding credit is there in an average of 16 sectors of the economy, covering almost 120 countries going back to 1940. And it's really this data set that allows us to empirically study the link between sectoral credit, business cycles, and crises. And so just to kind of give you a preview of the main results we find here, we find what we think are quite striking differences in macroeconomic outcomes following these different types of credit expansions, where kind of the headline finding is that lending to the non-tradable sector in particular, and also households, is associated with a slowdown in economic growth in the medium run, but credit to the tradable sector predicts stable or even higher growth. And consistent with these models of credit cycles with sectoral heterogeneity, it's really lending to non-tradables and households that predicts a boom and bust pattern in demand, it predicts a higher likelihood of systemic banking crises, and predicts lower productivity growth going forward, which at least in the models could reflect a misallocation of resources across sectors. So the key takeaway that we're trying to leave you with is that if you want to understand whether credit booms tend to end badly or not, this really seems to depend to a significant extent on what the credit is actually used for. And what we really want to emphasize is that distinguishing between different types of firm credit is really important for understanding the dynamics of credit cycles. Okay, so as I said, the backbone here is a new database on sectoral credit. And so what we essentially did is go back to the original sources of credit data in other data sets, and we identified, wherever possible, sectoral data. And so to do this, we had to go back to more than 600 individual country-specific sources, many of which were newly digitized or previously unpublished. And the real contribution here is that we harmonized these data with the help of more than 150 people from the different institutions so that they follow the most recent version of the International Standard Industry Classification. And so we plan to make these data available over the next couple of weeks, hopefully, and we're continuously working on improving it, and new versions will come out at some point next year. Okay, so what's nice about these data is that we can kind of reconfirm some findings about the composition of credit markets, but also provide some new stylized facts. So I just want to show you two here. On the left-hand side in this graph, I'm plotting you private credit relative to GDP. That's broken up by three major sectors. Dark blue are households at the top. The kind of middle blue in the middle is lending to non-bank financial institutions, and the bottom is lending to non-financial corporates. So this is a sample of around 100 countries. And so what you can see here is that really most of the increase in the ratio of credit to GDP we've seen over the past 30 years or so has come from household credit. As just kind of a replication of some earlier work with more data. What's nice here is that we can also dig into what actually accounts for changes in corporate credit here by sector. And so what I'm showing on the right-hand side are simply the shares of different industries in total firm credit. And what you can kind of see is that manufacturing and agriculture, and to a lesser extent mining, really accounted for the bulk of the business model or the lending business of financial institutions up to maybe the 1980s or so. But since then, there's really been a kind of continuous decline of that. And what you can see instead is kind of a rise of construction and real estate, which went from, maybe 3 or 4% market share in the 1960s to almost 30% today. And also the rise of the other sectors here, which are just the tertiary sector, other types of services. Now, in the interest of time, let me skip the case study we have and just jump right to the empirical exercise that we want to do. So to link these different types of credit expansions to the macroeconomy, we first have to start with defining different types of credit variables. So, following the theory literature here, we're differentiating between three major sectors. One, the tradable sector, by which we mean agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. The non-tradable sector, by which we mean construction, real estate, retail, wholesale trade, etc. Although the exact definition here of non-tradable sector, as you'll see, it doesn't really matter. And then, of course, households. And so, the first thing that you want to think about is, okay, how do these sectors actually differ from each other? What are the key differences? And so here again, these models, mainly in the open economy tradition, they first emphasize that these sectors might differ in how sensitive they are with respect to household demand. And so here I'm just showing you some basic statistics that suggest domestic households consume around 36% of the output of non-tradable sectors compared to 15% of tradable sectors. So what that means is that the non-tradable sector is just much more closer, more proximate to to final household demand. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we also see that the tradable sector exports more than the non-tradable sector. Now, the second key emphasis of that in these models is on financing constraints. And here, we just reconfirm some previous findings in this literature, which is that in the non-tradable sector, smaller firms, which might be more constrained, are considerably more common than in the tradable sector. And we also find that real estate collateral is much more commonly used in the non-tradable sector. And this is not only true in construction and real estate, but also if you look at food, accommodation, and other types of more local services. Now, the third key difference here is productivity. And so here we're just using some data from a paper by Mano and Castillo, but you can do this in many different ways. And essentially what you find is that both in levels and particularly in terms of growth rates, tradable sectors are just much more productive than non-tradable sectors. Okay, so equipped with this kind of baseline intuition, I will now show you impulse responses from running local projections that are commonly used in this literature. So in particular, I'll show you regressions of changes in log real GDP on country fixed effects, and then multiple lags of changes in credit to the non-tradable sector, the tradable sector, and households. And as a baseline here, we'll scale these over GDP, but we can also scale these firm credit variables over value added or output, and we'll get a very similar result. We're always going to look 10 years out into the future and put in 5 lags of the dependent variable and those credit variables to kind of soak up mean reversion to the extent possible in this exercise. And so I'm going to show you 2 different types of standard errors that account for potential spillovers between countries and time periods. And just in terms of how we should interpret what I'll show you next, while these local projections are not causal effects necessarily, we think they answer an interesting question, which is conditional on you seeing a particular type of credit expansion, what happens on average to GDP? Okay, so what I'm showing you here is the main result of our paper. So on the left-hand side, you can see what is the response of real GDP to innovations in lending to the non-tradable sector. And on the right-hand side, you see the same, but for the tradable sector. And for now, these don't take into account household credit. And so what these impulse responses suggest is that lending to the non-tradable sector is systematically associated with a slowdown in GDP after 4 or 5 years, but lending to the tradable sector is associated with stable or maybe even higher GDP growth going forward. And in the paper, we show that these patterns are really highly robust, and importantly, as I alluded to a while ago, they're really driven by changes in credit and not by changes in the composition of the economy in terms of tradable and non-tradable sector. But from previous work, we also know that household debt tends to be associated with economic slowdowns going forward. And we can replicate that here if you look at the right-hand side, just using a much larger data set. But importantly, if you look at this pattern of tradable and non-tradable sector credit, that's really unaffected by including household debt or not. We also find a similar pattern when we replace the dependent variable here with unemployment. And so here we can see perhaps an even more striking pattern in that it's really firm credit expansions that are concentrated in the non-tradable sector that are associated with a spike in unemployment, which you can see on the left-hand side. And so for these other types of credit, this pattern is really not as pronounced. And what it suggests is that it's really this non-tradable sector credit that seems to be quite important for macro fluctuations. Okay, so up to now, what I've shown you is just this kind of differentiation between non-tradable and tradable sectors using standard classifications that have been used in the literature. But instead of this kind of reduced form approach, we can also directly split up firm credit using the potential underlying primitives that we get from these models of credit cycles that have the sectoral heterogeneity. So what I'm showing you here are the results for splitting up firm credit based on the median value of 2 such characteristics that I already mentioned. One, the proximity to household demand of a particular industry, and second, in panel B, the share of small firms. And in both cases, you can see that these results actually line up quite closely with what we found for tradable versus non-tradable sectors. So credit to industries that are very close to households or sectors that have lots of small firms, those kind of predict a boom-bust pattern in GDP while other industries, if anything, are just kind of constant and have a constant positive correlation with growth. And we find a similar pattern using related characteristics. Okay, so I briefly want to say something about the potential underlying mechanisms here. So, as I mentioned in the theory literature, really there are three key reasons or three key predictions for why non-tradable credit, non-tradable sector credit particularly, should be associated with lower growth. Number one is that it can predict a credit-driven demand boom and bust, where the idea is now, because of this non-tradable sector credit, that can be linked to a real exchange rate appreciation and a reallocation of employment and output to the non-tradable sector. And you get that prediction, for example, in work by Schmidt, Groen, or Riebe. Just in the interest of time, I'll skip over that. Then the second prediction is that lending to non-tradables and households should predict financial crises. And you get that, for example, in Schneider and Tornell. And actually, conditional on you seeing a crisis, the losses should be concentrated in the non-tradable sector. The third prediction that we get is that lending to non-tradables and households should predict lower productivity growth, which you get from a widely cited paper by Ricardo Reis on the Portuguese slump, where the idea is, well, if on average the tradable sector is more productive and the non-tradable sector is less productive, then lending more to the less productive sector can make the economy grow less in aggregate. And so with the remainder of my time here, I just want to skip ahead and show you some results on the financial crisis. So the first thing that we can do here is just to replicate the existing literature, which has found that in the run-up to systemic banking crises, you see that there's an increase in the ratio of credit to GDP. And this is kind of what you can see in the graph here, which is kind of an event study around 58 banking crises. Now, what we find with our more detailed data is that the run-up to these crises is really characterized both by growth in household and firm credit, and perhaps you can see that household debt expands a bit earlier than firm credit. But what's really important is what happens when we dig into this firm credit and the firm credit growth before crisis. And what we find here is that virtually all of it is driven by lending to these non-tradable sector industries like construction and others. And importantly, this is not only real estate related, but we also find a very similar pattern if we look for sectors like retail, trade, accommodation, and food, which is particularly important in emerging economies, and to a lesser extent, also more in emerging economies, transport and communication. If you look at agriculture or manufacturing, you will find very little relationship with banking crises. And in fact, we can also replicate this finding using kind of standard predictive regressions, where the dependent variable here is the probability of a banking crisis happening within 1, 2, 3 years. And here what we find is that a 1 standard deviation higher non-tradable sector credit predicts that the probability of you seeing a crisis in the data goes from an unconditional 3% to something like 10%. And in fact, if you look at the coefficients here, it really looks like non-tradable sector firm credit is an even better predictor of crises than household. Now, in the interest of time, let me just conclude here and say that our argument is that the sectoral allocation of credit seems to matter for macroeconomic fluctuations, which we think is a kind of a novel finding empirically. And we believe that the patterns we document here provide some new perspectives on why it is that credit is sometimes associated with these growth slowdowns and crises, and sometimes associated with good growth outcomes. And so, if you take those findings at face value, we think that there are several potential implications. So, number one, they show that this heterogeneity in firm credit seems to be quite important for understanding credit cycles. And the story doesn't only seem to be about housing versus non-housing or household versus firm debt. And of course, since we're at the Spanish Central Bank here, if you want to interpret these as they are, these correlations, then they would suggest a stronger role for some types of sectoral regulations from a financial stability perspective. Although, of course, caveats apply, right? We know from work in political economy that these kind of more targeted regulations are much more difficult to implement. So, thank you again for having me, and I look forward to Veronica's discussion.
Thank you very much, Karsten, and thank you very much for sticking to the time. I really didn't know in this online version how to discreetly tell you about the time left. So thank you. Thank you. Veronica, it's up to you.
Thanks. Well, first of all, thanks the organizer and Rafa in particular for inviting me and for having the opportunity to discuss this paper. Here we go. So this is a super interesting paper. So first, this is an amazing data set. And I just learned here that they're going to make it available, so even better. So it covers 50 years of data, more than 100 countries. It has household, mortgages, firms, and the sectors of the activity sectors of the firm. And it's not going to be the focus of my discussion, and it was not the focus of Karsten's presentation, but he shows in the descriptive statistics already very interesting cross-country long trends in sector allocation of credit, and I'm sure and I'm hopeful that we will learn more about those long-term cross-country trends later in future papers. So, focusing on these co-movements, what Karsten showed is that actually household and non-tradable credit or corporate credit to non-tradable sectors look very much alike. Tradable credit does not. So first of all, he showed us this already. If we see the GDP growth response function towards innovations in non-tradable credit, in tradable credit, and in household credit, we see that both non-tradable credit and household predict a future slowdown. Tradable credit or credit towards the tradable sector, the opposite. He also showed, well, I'm sorry, we cannot see the gray area, but he shows changes in credit to GDP going towards time zero, which is the time of a banking sector, and later. And for that, he looks at many different countries and many different banking crisis episodes, and we see that both non-tradable credit towards non-tradable sectors and towards household peak before time zero, the time of a crisis, and really drops quite dramatically afterwards. Credit towards firms in the tradable sector does not. And this, I think, is very interesting because, I mean, we just had listened to a very interesting paper before in which Marcus showed us the cyclicality of household credit and the different constraints. We kind of know that household credit has this cyclicality. We know much less about corporate sector, probably because we didn't have this sectoral decomposition. So it looked a little bit not obvious what the trends are once you open them into tradables and non-tradable credit. Well, we see this pattern emerging, which is novel in the data, and I think this is super interesting. What I find a little bit more difficult in understanding is to what to compare these patterns, what to expect, what is the null hypothesis, and this is going to be the focus of my presentation. So I'm going to present as a null hypothesis as a benchmark for understanding these fluctuations and these co-movements in the sectoral allocation of credit, a real economy of tradables and non-tradables with perfect capital mobility, with perfect capital allocation, but where maybe, and I'm saying only maybe, the imperfections in the allocation of credit is coming from the household budget constraint, and that moves or that initiates the rest of the real co-movements. So me coming from trade, I'm going to show you a classic Hertzsche-Röhling model, but instead of having goods A and B, clothes and cars, do tradable goods, I'm going to have tradables and non-tradables, quantities that can be consumption and output. The green line is the production possibility frontier. Probably you are used to that concave curve production possibility frontier, but this is with perfect capital mobility. So it becomes a line, and the line is really the labor constraint, because the capital is going to adjust to whatever is needed as long as the return on capital is the international rate of return to capital R. This is a small open economy. And it's steeper than the budget constraint, because it's well understood that tradable goods are, in general, more capital intensive than non-tradable goods. Non-tradable goods are more labor intensive. So since the production possibility frontier captures labor, then we have this very steep production possibility frontier, and the tradable goods sector is therefore more, the productivity of labor is higher because it uses more capital. The red line is the household intertemporal budget constraint. So in equilibrium, we are in a point of tangency between the indifference curve and that budget constraint. The slope is coming from the relative price of tradables and non-tradables, and I located that optimal consumption basket in current account balance, where the output in tradables is equal to the consumption in tradables. So it's another way of saying these households have, on average, zero international net position, and therefore they have, in a steady state, a balanced current account. Now, what happens if this intertemporal household budget constraint is relaxed? And that can come from evaluation effect, say, price of housing, it might be sustainable or not, it might be a bubble, or relaxation of credit constraint like Marcus was referring to before. It might be optimal or not, it might be a reckless relaxation of the credit standards or not. Well, then we have a shift in the household budget constraint. I am assuming homothetic preferences, so they expand, keeping the ratio of tradables and non-tradables in the consumption basket. But what is important is in the sector that is non-tradable, output is always equal to consumption. By definition, there's no trade. And therefore, that sector, the non-tradable sector, expands together with household budget constraint. On the tradable side, well, the opposite happens, because more resources are reallocated towards the non-tradable sector. Although consumption in tradable also changes, I assume homothetic preferences. It's even, this is even more if the angle curve goes more towards non-tradable. But the output in tradable shrinks, compresses. The difference is coming from imports. So we see that deterioration in the current account that is often associated with this type of macro movements. Now, this is with total perfect capital mobility in the real sector, in production, so capital efficiently allocates between the two sectors. What might give us here the triggers of this boom and bust is that the household budget constraint relaxed in an unsustainable manner. Now, once that relaxation occurs, well, this co-movement between non-tradables and tradables is to be expected. And I'm not including in here any difference in the financial fragility of the firms in the two sides, any frictions in credit allocation, or any problems in credit allocation across sectors. What I'm trying to say with this is the following. This is, I think, very useful because in giving us these stylized facts, these describing facts, we learn more about what are the sources of the shocks that better capture what is going to be a boom and bust cycle. So it looks to be consistent with this household realization of the budget constraint. And we are reinforcing that existing boom and bust stories in the literature. But there's some questions that I'm not yet feeling so sure that we can answer. So is this tradable versus non-tradable credit allocation adding extra to that business cycle dynamic beyond the seed that was already introduced by the household shock? That I don't know. Can we say something about the fragility of the financial sector associated with the two types of credit? I don't know. Maybe we can, and I hope we go in that direction. But with these aggregate figures, it's difficult to say. Still, I think this is very compelling that the business cycle, that the credit cyclical components are there. So even if I am not yet convinced that there's this good credit associated with tradables and bad credit associated with non-tradable, even if there's not a problem of inefficient allocation of resources, it might still be that if we want to lean against the wind in terms of macroprudential regulation, we have to take into account all these cyclical components of credit. So it might be that a good macroprudential regulation also includes these different aspects of credit, even if it's not the originator of the cycle. So just to conclude, I think this is super interesting, and I'm sure they're going to be coming even more interesting papers, so looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Karsten, technology allowing, would you like to reply? Oh, yes, we see you.
Absolutely. No, let me just start by thanking Veronica for this super interesting and thought-provoking discussion. I've had the pleasure of presenting this paper quite a few times, but I think you're really getting at the core of some of these questions, and so I just want to thank you for that. And let me quickly just respond to two simple points. So the first question that I really like that you raised is, can we say something about the financial fragility of the non-tradable sector and perhaps the banking sector as a whole that would allow us to actually tie these credit expansions to kind of more directly to crises or bad outcomes originating from these firm sectors. And so here, one piece of evidence that we've just added to the paper is that when you look at non-performing loans in the aftermath of banking crises, and you look at the composition of these non-performing loans, and two things stand out. So the first thing, as I'm sure you're very aware at the Banco de España, if you look at default rates in the tradable and non-tradable sector after, say, the 2008 crisis, and the non-performing loans peaked somewhere like in 2014 or so, there you see that the default rates as non-performing loans compared to the stock of outstanding loans, that default rate was twice as high in the non-tradable sector in Spain compared to the tradable sector, and you see a similar pattern after other banking crises as well. And because credit growth tends to be concentrated in the non-tradable sector before crises, together with this higher default rate, what you get is that on average, something like half of all non-performing loans after crises are in the non-tradable sector. Perhaps a quarter is, or a little bit more than a quarter is in households, and the rest are other industries. And so, in Spain, for example, or also in Portugal after 2008, this was even more dramatic. I think almost 60% of all NPLs after those crises were in the non-tradable sector. So what that suggests to us is that this is really kind of an immediate link between things going badly on the firm credit side, people defaulting on the firm credit side, that then can affect bank health, which then can lead to a banking crisis. So I think that's kind of the best evidence that we have at the moment to directly tie that together. And just one very minor point. We absolutely agree that this household demand channel that you highlighted, right, this trade channel, if you will, is going to be really important for a lot of these dynamics. But at least in the work that we've spent the most time consuming, you actually need some kind of sectoral leverage. So, you actually need changes in the leverage of, say, the non-tradable sector to get these really bad crisis dynamics, also quantitatively. There's just a handful of studies on that. But Yeah, I think these are great questions, and thanks so much again.
Thank you, Karsten. Let's see whether there are questions from the audience. Okay, 3 questions. Oh, okay. I know the 3.
Okay, Javier Suarez from Senfi. Thank you for the presentation. I want to actually follow up on Veronica's perspective, which I found very illuminating. So is maybe at least part of these credit fluctuations that you identify a credit account deficit type boom, consumption boom, internal demand boom, going bust. And so you are just seeing the credit side of it, of course, right? As you accumulate current account imbalances, you are having financial flows. In the background, most of those flows are through the banks and in connection to the global financial system. Now the story then could be different, right? Or could be just the credit side of a global imbalances story, excessive fluctuations coming from terms of trade or whatever else, maybe international monetary policies that are feeding local bubbles, and because you have expanded your sample to such an enormous number of countries, probably you are capturing things that were not captured when just focusing on the most developed countries. So it's possible also that the expansion of your analysis to a larger number of countries is identifying new aspects of this. So this is just one question. Which leads to whether there will be a way to refine the empirical analysis, see which part of the credit developments is really bringing impulse to a more real side or current account side of the story. I think this would be my main question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. Karsten?
Yeah, no, these are great points, Javier. Thank you so much. So I definitely agree that a lot of this is plausibly driven by capital inflows, smaller countries being kind of price takers in international markets and facing some kind of international interest rate for sure. That said, I think there are kind of 2 ingredients that for us suggest that it's not the only story, which is number one, it's not so obvious, at least, that you should see an increase in the leverage of the non-tradable sector in response to that. So that's just not so obvious from the models. You usually don't necessarily have that ingredient without some kind of financial friction. And the second thing is what I just mentioned about the composition of non-performing loans. So, if you think that there's some excessive risk-taking going on in the non-tradable sector, for example, as one potential kind of financial channel, then that would be a very obvious explanation why you see higher default rates after the crises, while maybe it's not as obvious, right, if you just consider these kind of international channels. Now, how do we tease those things apart? I think there are kind of 2 things that we can do. So the number one, and maybe the most important thing that we haven't been able to address, because it's very difficult, is we have to look at other things than just credit quantities. Right? So if we have information on prices, if we have information on other types of loan terms, etc., then it might become easier to tease apart what is really a demand boom. So particular sectors demanding lots of credit in response to, say, a household demand shock, and that's why they want to borrow a lot. In that case, I guess the intuition would be, well, then interest rates should be going up because people are demanding lots of money. And so while on the other hand, if there are some independent push factors, if you will, some kind of financial friction story where now that there's maybe a lower interest rate in the economy, now banks want to push more credit into the non-tradable sector. then we should see that some measure of risk premium or interest rate spread should be stable or even going down, reflecting kind of the supply expansion. And so the only thing we've done there is to look at case studies. And as you well know, Spain is one example. It's not the case that spreads in the non-tradable sector or in the economy in Spain were drastically going up in the 2000s, right? They were trending downward. So I think at this point that's the best evidence we have, but there's much more work that needs to be done there.
Thank you. There was a question.
Thank you. Ilu Fontaine. Yes, of course, similar to Javier's question in following up on where this comes from. I may have missed a few things, but I mean, the obvious question to me is why does credit flow the way it flows? And I'm not sure whether your data could tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, for example, controlling for firm size, an obvious candidate, maybe non-tradable sectors, smaller firm size, has different characteristics, etc., etc. I mean, it's just, I think it's not clear to me why we see credit flowing into what in the end is less productive or less growing sectors, and that may have to do with the nature of the financial system underlying this, which of course you have on your agenda. And so the question is, for example, do we have more local bank lending to non-tradable firms, which are potentially smaller, so the usual hairdresser shop around the corner, versus different types of credit flowing to stronger export-oriented firms, which may then be larger, or in particular maybe more competitive because they have to compete internationally rather than with the barber shop across the street. So there may be simple variables which you may bring forward to tell us a little bit why we see these credit flows, and I have a good theory in my mind where this allocation goes, but I mean this issue of how is credit intermediated may play a role.
Yeah, 100% agree, super important. And in this paper we just take what we see in the data is given, right? So in this paper, we're not studying that because, as you said, right, there are many potential things. I just want to give a quick shout out actually to excellent paper by Mariassunta, who actually looked at this question of who was lending before banking crises. There's a very interesting paper on that, and there she actually finds that before banking crises, it's really foreign banks that tend to lend more to the non-tradable sector, and kind of, as you said, as you had in mind, also to smaller borrowers that are risky, etc. Actually, in her data at least, I think it's the foreign banks that do that, so not so much the local banks. So that's, I think, the only piece of evidence we have, but it would be very interesting to study this more.
One last question over there.
Yeah. I have one question. The micro is a bit related to what?
Yeah, sorry, the
if
mic
you can
is
speak closer to the microphone.
The mic? No, it seems not. Okay, now. Okay, Jan Khan. So I start again. So I would be interested in the micro foundations of what you call tradable and non-tradable, and I venture a hypothesis that maybe everything that is growing is becomes tradable. That's basically how it grows. And so you have an endogeneity here that you treat this as if this would be exogenous in a way, but maybe it's not.
No, I think the point you're raising is also related to the question of how static should we think of these types of patterns over time, right? So as you said, if what was tradable 30 years ago is maybe not even traded that much anymore, but now we have some skilled tradable services, right, that account for important trade patterns, right? How does that change these dynamics? I think how you want to think about this in our setting is that tradable, non-tradable, we think is a very useful classification apparently in the data where we didn't make this up, right? We kind of took it motivated from these credit cycle models that talk about tradable, non-tradable, and some classifications people have used there. But what I think is important is that we can't really disentangle here which of these micro foundations is going to be more important, simply because they're so highly correlated. Right? So for industries with lots of small firms, well, those on average have lower productivity. Those on average are non-tradable. Those on average are closer to final household demand. They on average use more real estate collateral. But so we tried in our setting to tease apart some of these things. But for that, I think the data are too aggregated, or we don't have an exhaustionist shock. But I think that's actually really, really crucial to understand, and we hope to see more work with microdata on that question.
Okay, thank you again, Karsten and Veronica. And let's now invite the presenter and the discussion of the third paper, Mariassunta, Giannetti, and Ansgar, Walther.
Slide. Yes, here. Of course.
Okay, Mariassunta, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for having me. This is a joint work with Ralph Meisensal that is sitting there in the audience, and you can address the questions to him as well. So what is the paper about? So most of us, when we think about credit, we think that credit is erogated and held by banking financial institutions. As a matter of fact, however, in recent times, and especially after the global financial crisis, credit has been shifting to non-banking financial institutions, and this creates a new issue for financial stabilities. So, for instance, the policy debate in later year has been focusing on the possibilities that financial intermediaries like collateralized loan obligations, what we generally call CLOs, might create financial instability because they have less stable funding sources than banks. Since they are subject to some constraints, they may liquidate their asset, creating fire sales with systemic implication, because this would spill over to the balance sheet of other intermediaries. So this part of the financial instability potentially created by these non-banking financial intermediaries has started to be addressed in the literature. What we are interested in here is, however, a bit different. These incentives of banks and other regulated intermediaries to sell their loans become much, much stronger when there is an initial shock to credit quality. So we will look at regulatory downgrades. Now, these initial shocks mean that some borrowers are in difficulties, but they are not necessarily bankrupt. Potentially, these loans might be cured. What we don't know from the current literature is what happens to these borrowers, who buys the loans, and do the new intermediaries that buy the loans have the incentives and the skills to renegotiate and attempt to cure the loans. From what we know in the literature, this is potentially very important. So what I am citing there is papers that in the context of the syndicated bank loan market have shown that loans are frequently renegotiated by banks, and that this renegotiation is very important for the future performance of the borrowers. So what happens when these loans are reallocated? We don't know this, and this is what Ralph and I are after. So the paper has ideally two parts. That is, we start by trying to understand who owns syndicated bank loans that are downgraded and that are starting to deteriorate. So we should provide some evidence that regulated intermediaries are particularly likely to sell. And then we ask who is buying. And what is crucial about these new intermediaries is, do they just buy at rock bottom prices and wait for the potential reappreciation of the price because they bought a fire sales price, so some borrower will improve again? Or do they try to take actions to improve the future performance of the borrowers? And if so, they have incentive to do so. In order to think of the incentives that these intermediaries may have to renegotiate and to cure the loan, we think of concentration of the ownership of the syndicate. And this is related to influential work in the context of bankruptcy, because if there are too many lenders, clearly there are negative spillovers that are not internalized. So we will look at whether who are these new entry and whether the ownership of the loan becomes more concentrated, potentially when it's more needed to do so. And then we will try to make some causal statement asking whether this ownership structure of the syndicate matters for the future loan performance. And I will tell you how we try to get some exogenous variation. So so basically the question I'm posing here is how worried do we have to be that banks and potentially also CLOs that are specialized in credit sell deteriorating loans? So this figure shows you in the event time how the ownership concentration that we measure using the number of lenders evolves after a regulatory downgrade. You see that the loan becomes more concentrated. So what this would suggest is there are potentially in this market incentives to cure the loans. But this is just suggestive, but if you want to remember only one thing of this presentation, this is the figure to remember. So let me give you a more articulate summary of our finding. We find that banks and also the CLOs sell after regulatory downgrades. And these are banks, of course, have capital requirements that increase if there is a regulatory downgrade. And the CLOs are subject to other constraints that may become binding if these regulatory downgrades are followed by agency downgrades. So this is completely consistent with our expectation. Who buys? Well, we find there are thousands and thousands of participants in the international syndicated loan market, but the intermediaries that are more likely to purchase are mutual funds and hedge funds. So these are unregulated intermediaries that have an open-end structure, so they are potentially more subject to redemption. We also find, however, that these all the new owners tend to concentrate the ownership of the loan. And this is more likely if the borrower has characteristics that potentially make the renegotiation costly. We also find that a higher concentration is then related to better loan outcomes. We will identify situations in which there are constraints that prevent these new intermediaries to concentrate the loans. And in those cases, the ownership of the loan remains more dispersed, and we observe fewer renegotiation and worse performance of the loan going forward. So let me tell you, so in the interest of time, let me be very brief on the literature. I just want to tell that Ralph has done work on the secondary market for syndicated bank loans before. We know that banks tend to divest. What we are showing here that is new in this respect is that we subordinate to regulatory downgrade and we follow loans that are experiencing initial difficulties. We are not talking about borrowers that are in bankruptcy, but what we talk about is informative about a more established literature on bankruptcy. Of course, our theoretical hypotheses are inspired by Bolton and Sharfstein and the concentration of credit that facilitate renegotiation. But also from an empirical point of view in this literature, to the best of our knowledge, there is no causal evidence that ownership concentration of credit leads to better borrower outcome. In an empirical context that is similar, but in which we can have a much larger sample, we argue that we can provide some of this evidence. So we use regulatory data from the board, the Shared National Credit Program. And what we have basically each quarter after a loan is issued, we observe who are the owners of the loan. We have over 12,000 loans, and the filter that is needed is that these must be large loans held by regulated financial institutions, because otherwise the board is not interested in collecting this data. So what I mean about a deteriorating loan and what I will mean about downgrades is loans have the regulatory rate, the 5 regulatory ratings that you observe in these slides, and of course all loans when they are issued are in good standing and have a pass, but a few of these loans are actually downgraded. Special mention loans, there is some uncertainty about the future ability of the borrower to repay, but these are still reasonably good loans, and then as you go down the list, these loans become worse and worse, and the lost loans have some are very unlikely to repay in full. So we also have agency ratings. We could perform this analysis with agency ratings, but we are currently focusing on regulatory ratings because they are fewer and they are easier to deal with. So what you observe in these slides is that different type of financial institutions tend to hold a different proportion of loans with different credit quality. And the main takeaway of this figure is that banks own a larger proportion of loans that are in good standing, the pass loans, and as the credit quality deteriorates, mutual funds and hedge funds tend to own a larger proportion of the loans. We could show this in a more sophisticated multivariate setting, but in the interest of time, let me move at telling you who are the buyers of deteriorating loans. So who are the new owners? The new owners of deteriorating loans are more likely to be mutual fund and hedge fund. So these are regulated financial institutions that are not subject to any constraints. So it is, and what you observe here is that after one of these regulatory downgrade, banks are less likely to be the largest owners. Mutual funds are somewhat more likely to be the largest owners. So since banks have been associated with loan renegotiation and refinancing, this may raise the concern that once this credit has been transferred, the borrower is basically tossed. And this is what motivates our subsequent analysis. So the first step that we perform is that we look at a different measure of ownership concentration of the loan, and we ask whether after a downgrade, in the 3 quarters after a downgrade, we observe that a different measure of ownership concentration increases. We find that with a different set of fixed effects that aim to pick different type of shocks, that there is a very strong evidence that the loans on average become more concentrated, the number of borrowers decreases substantially. And what is comforting is that the kind of loans that become more concentrated are the ones that typically in corporate finance we believe would be either would be more costly not to renegotiate and for which would be more costly to have a liquidation. So these are loans in industry with low asset tangibility, high R&D, and these are also loans for which the borrowers might be only in temporary difficulties because the loan is in an industry with high cash flow volatility. Also, if there is more surplus to be shared because the leverage is low, the loan is more likely to become concentrated, and this will lead to more renegotiation. We also find that this concentration, consistent with our prior, is a way to substitute for the lack of a lead bank in the renegotiation. So we see that concentration after a regulatory downgrade increases to a larger extent if the lead bank has currently or at origination a lower share. So, ideally, we would like to say that concentration leads to better loan outcome. Of course, this is hard and is plagued by endogeneity problem. Why? Well, I would expect that any owner decides to increase its share of the loan if it expects better loan performance. So in order to try to get closer to something that is causal, we look at potential frictions that are arguably unrelated to the future performance of the loan that might prevent buyers to concentrate the ownership. So what we have in mind, that is a bit related to previous work of Alberto, is that, well, if these participants in the syndicated loan market have recently experienced a downgrade in their portfolio in industries that are unrelated to the one of the current loan that we are exploring, they might be either financially constrained or time constrained because renegotiation require effort. So basically, we look at, for each lender, at the share of the portfolio of the lender in other industry that has been downgraded. And we can look at, on average, how many participants in the syndicated loan market have been affected. So does the economic story carry through? Well, what you observe here is that when there is a higher share of participants in the syndicated loan market that have been affected by downgrades, there is less trading in the syndicated loan market. So the ownership is affected. Also, does the downgrade share predict the performance of loans for which we would expect these wouldn't have to matter. So if this is a good candidate instrument, it should matter only because it affects the ownership concentration of the syndicate of loans that have been downgraded. So it should not predict the performance of loans that still have a pass grade, because these loans don't need to be renegotiated, and they might be performing well no matter what. So what you observe here is that the conditions in the syndicated loan market are unrelated to the probability of refinancing of loans that still have the pass grade. When we look at loans that have been recently downgraded, however, if you look at the first stage, in the second part of the table, what you see is that the downgrade share predicts a larger number of owners for these loans that are deteriorating. So we argue that we can interpret these as a financial constraint that prevents this concentration of the syndicate. And what you observe in the second stage is that these loans are less likely to be refinanced, amended, and in the future the loan is more likely to be downgraded, less likely to be upgraded. The effect seems to be stronger in the subsample of loans in which the top owner is not a bank. So let me conclude is we take a first look at the market for deteriorating loans, and what our analysis suggests is that at least when there are no pervasive financial constraints, an increase in ownership concentration may help the refinancing and the cure of the loans in this market. And I look to the comments of my
Thank you very much, Mariassunta. Ansgar, your turn.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go a little bit in reverse. I'm going to give an overview of the facts that are in the paper without any sales pitch, and then I'm going to have some thoughts on what the sales pitch is, and then I'm going to do something very risky, which is that I, as a theorist, I'm going to give you my thoughts on the instrumental variable. So, take that as you will. Okay, here's the setting. There's lots of different institutions lending large amounts of money to firms in this market. Those institutions are banks, CLOs, mutual funds, and to some extent hedge funds, although they're quite small share. Loans are traded in a secondary market, and these syndicates of banks and other institutions have varying concentration. So in terms of how many of them are involved, what is the HHI, etc., there's a lot of variation that we're going to exploit here. Regulators in this market flag impaired loans. So you've got this categorization that you already saw on Mariassunta's slides, which is pass, special mention, substandard, doubtful, and an outright loss. And this picture shows from the paper that, as you go down that scale, you're looking at worse prospects in terms of credit ratings. The results are very simple and very clear, and that's a big plus about the paper, I think. It's really well written, and they isolate these facts incredibly well. First, banks sell impaired loans that have been downgraded to funds, to a first approximation. Second, after a downgrade, syndicates become more concentrated through trading in the secondary market. And third, syndicate concentration, in the sense of a low number of holders in the syndicate, causally leads to better loan outcomes. That's where the IV comes in. And better loan outcomes in the sense of more amendments, fewer downgrades. And so, there might be some efficient renegotiation going on. Fact number one, you can already see in the raw data. So, even if you just look at average shares, you can see that the substandard, doubtful, and loss have a much bigger green slab in this picture, and that's funds. and a much smaller blue slab, and that's banks, right? That's the sort of sales from banks to funds. And the supplement to that is that the largest holder of shares of any given loan is much more likely to be a fund and much less likely to be a bank if it's got a bad rating. Fact number 3 is a little bit separate from that, but this is the regression that we saw at the end, right? The significant coefficients are on amendments and downgrades. So that's saying that if the number of lenders goes up, which means that there's less concentration, right? They're more dispersed, your lenders, then there's going to be arguably less renegotiation, which means you're more likely to get a downgrade. It's bad news, right? And a low number of lenders is good news. And here that's been instrumented with the distressed lender share that we saw in the slides. So basically the idea there is, suppose there's a distressed investor who's active in industries A and B and who would like to buy a large share of a failing syndicate in industry A. But the same distressed investor has just experienced a bunch of heavy downgrades and losses in industry B and is facing a tighter financial constraint internally, right? So then they should be less likely to start buying up in industry A, and you can use it as an instrument for concentration in A. That's the idea. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about research questions. So the first question that this paper kind of answers is who buys and who sells in a fire sale in the syndicated loan market. You have concentration of distressed assets in the funds part of the market, and it flows out of the banks part of the market, which I think is an important quantification to inform a lot of macrofinance models that have fire sales in them. And they usually don't take this heterogeneity in different kinds of intermediaries very seriously, but maybe they should. Because, you know, funds are less levered than banks, and these models are often about leverage, and it seems important to take that into account. And I'll talk about that a bit more in the next few slides. So the other question that the paper answers is, what is the causal effect of concentration in a syndicate? Right? If I take the IV regression at face value, that's what it says. And it kind of says that concentration of any kind, whether it's funds or banks or whatever, as long as the number of people in the syndicate is low, that's good news for future outcomes in a distressed loan. That's good news for things like, hopefully, renegotiation. Right? And one thing I would maybe push you to do is to connect these two questions a bit more and to maybe pick which one is the primary one in the paper. So, you know, is this concentration in funds? Is the fact that banks are selling to funds, is that the good thing? Is that what's driving the better outcomes? I would say that maybe in facts 2 and 3, you could change the right-hand side variable from being just number of holders to something that's more fund-specific to really test whether that's what's going on. I think that seems like an easy fix, and I'd like to see that if you're going to push this paper as being really about the renegotiation channel. And it's interesting because it says that, you know, we write models of banking, but really the people that sort things out when they go bad are these outside funds, distress investors, that have nothing to do with the banks. And so the regression should be about them, I think. Something that I've done some work on recently is leakage in macrofinance. So, you know, I have a paper with Eduardo where we ask how we do imperfect financial regulation. So suppose you're in a world where you can regulate banks, but you cannot regulate mutual funds to a first approximation. Okay, so the formula is very simple. It comes out in any model you can write down, really. It's that on the left-hand side, you've got, let's say, the Pigouvian tax that you should put on the regulated sector. And on the right-hand side, you've got delta R, which is the marginal externality of the regulated sector. Let's say, you know, the difference between marginal social and private costs of a certain type of risky investment. A certain type of leveraged risky investment in the regulated sector. But to that, in the second best world, you need to add the distortion in the unregulated sector, which is the delta U, so the externality imposed by things like funds doing the same activity, times what we call the leakage elasticity. So when I make a regulatory constraint bind and push, say, holdings of distressed loans out of the banking system to what extent does the unregulated system substitute for that? That's this elasticity on the right-hand side, dx unregulated by dx regulated, where x is the activity of interest. Okay, and so that turns out to be a sufficient statistic for how you should do second best regulation. So if, for example, there's substitution and there's leakage, and you think that the unregulated sector also imposes a negative externality, then you basically want to take your foot off the gas when you make these constraints bind in the regulated system. Otherwise, all you're doing is squeezing the balloon on one side and it pops up on the other. And, I'll advertise our paper quickly. It has a very general formula, applies to lots of things. But what I was thinking about is that this could be an alternative pitch for fact number 1 in this paper as well, which is they're measuring a new leakage elasticity, right? There's no doubt that the reason that banks sell the impaired loans when they get a bad regulatory rating is because they don't want to hold the capital against them, right? They're trying to get rid of a binding capital constraint. And then, not surprisingly, the people who buy are ones that are not capital regulated, right? So there is increasing concerns out there about whether asset management and the concentration of risk in asset management is also a concern for financial stability, right? Especially since 2008, asset management has grown very rapidly. I've recently written a review paper with Franklin where we sort of think about review of wide literature that talks about potential risks, potential runs on funds, potential outflows from funds that could create instability. That would mean that delta U, the unregulated party's externality here, would be positive. They would be, qualitatively also on the same side as banks. Or it could be that the externality is great, so delta U could be negative if these unregulated people are just much better renegotiators, right? So that's something we'd have to qualify separately, but basically regulators should want to know the leakage. They should want to know to what extent, when I squeeze banks, does it flow into funds? And that's what you're providing a direct measurement for with fact number 1, right? And it complements my other favorite paper on shadow banking, also by Ralph. Okay, now finally, what do I think of the IV? I sort of buy it. I think that measured downgrades here are just in terms of unrelated industries, which I think in this paper just means any other industry, right? So if you're in industry A and you want to instrument for how many people are buying up loans there, you look at how many downgrades have they faced in all other industries that are not A. I think you could make this stronger also by looking at far away industries in the sense that they're really unrelated. If they're if they're buying up loans on the industry for cars and they've made losses in the industry for teddy bears, that's much more plausible that that's exogenous than if it's, something that's close to a car. I'd also, again, maybe think about making that a little bit more fund-specific, because if you think about models of fire sales, suppose you have concentrated purchases by funds in industry A, and the current IV would be the exposures of all lenders in A to downgrades in B. Right? If only banks in A are exposed to downgrade somewhere else, this would mean that the banks are selling, but the funds still have a lot of cash. So the funds would then be like, great, there's a fire sale, I have lots of cash, I'm going to buy. Right? So there would be a dampening factor which would bias your estimates towards 0. And I think, again, maybe you can look at, if you're interested in the fund story, look at, lender downgrades as an IV focusing only on funds or related institutions. Okay, my final point is just pointing out one other part of the narrative that I think is neat, and it makes sense in terms of the theories that you're testing. So all the facts have significant coefficients, mostly for the bad but not terrible loans, the special mention and the substandard. And for the terrible loans, the doubtful and the loss, you have some unconditional increases in concentration, but as far as I can see, they don't make it through the first stage of the IV. So this is really a story about, benign downgrades. You're still quite far from default, and then these specialist investors can help you out. And it'd be interesting to think a little bit more about why that happens, right? So maybe renegotiation just can't help loans that are too far gone. It'd be nice to talk about whether that's consistent with the data and with the theories like Bolton and Scharfstein that you've already mentioned. Okay, but overall I really enjoyed reading this, great work, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ansgar.
So thanks a lot for your comment. So I like this framing with regulatory leakage, and I agree we should stress a bit more these benign downgrades. And I think it's very intuitive because it's in those set of loans in which there is uncertainty on whether the borrower is in temporary difficulties or is what we nowadays call a zombie. So, but for sure we should stress it a bit more. I like a lot your comments about the instrument that we can for sure refine a lot. We should also explain it much better, though, in the sense that what we are trying to do now using these is a within industry year estimator, okay? And indeed, we could kick away some related industry, but what we are using now is variation on whether a loan has been downgraded a quarter before or 1 quarter later. That might be some luck, a bit more relatively random variation, and that is what is largely giving us statistical power, but it's something that we should explain much better, and of course your suggestion can give us more power, so thank you.
Any questions from the audience? Oren.
I just wanted to point out the connection between this paper and the discussion that we had yesterday in the round table or whatever about digital currencies. So there the fear or the concern was that digital currencies would lead to decoupling of payments and financial intermediation. What this paper, I think, tells us is that the decoupling is already happening, perhaps because of regulation and perhaps because other reasons. But the expertise for debt restructuring, to a large extent, or to some extent, has migrated away from the banks to non-banks. And that's why people like John Conliffe can be so relaxed about the introduction of digital currencies. So maybe the causality goes in the opposite direction than what we have discussed yesterday.
So we are still talking about a secondary loan market. So I agree with the broad argument, and these are large borrowers and large loans. So I would be a bit more cautious about SME lendings and the fact that we can do without. Yeah, but yeah, that's.
On SME, there is a small discussion about similar things.
That's.
Thank you. There is another question.
Thank you very much for an interesting paper. I was wondering if we could have a bit more information of who enters, who buys. So is it funds that are somehow related to the original banks? So are they maybe affiliated? Do they get some credit? So is there something about that? Is it, some information about that could help us, understand who are the buyers in these situations?
So I think Ralph can answer better, but I would say it would be difficult because what we call mutual funds is a lot of structures. Also, some are something that you and me as a private investor going to a bank wouldn't be able to sell, to buy very easily. So we have some 10,000 funds, so it would be very hard to classify as affiliated and unaffiliated. I would think most of them are unaffiliated because of this share size, but it would be hard to verify. Of course, we could see whether some institutions always invest together and then whether they are the ones that come in, but it would be a bit a different definition of financial affiliation. So based on the portfolio, we can do a lot. Based on the institutional structure, I think it would be really hard.
Following up on David's question, what do we know about the banks who are selling? I mean, are you able to know something about their balance sheets, for example? I mean, for example, could we tease out whether they are literally hitting the equity regulation constraint, or whether they are in fact doing it more for, let's say, risk aversion or voluntary reasons? Is there any information that you have on balance sheets to distinguish between those two potential or other motives?
Yeah. So I think this is the focus of Ralph's previous work, the RFS 2021. So here we chose to focus on what happens to the borrower. Is in that paper, without considering the borrower characteristic, Ralph is focusing more on these cross-sectional differences between the banks. And as far as I remember, capital constraints and the financial condition of the banks are very important in explaining what. Yeah, this could be added very easily. Yeah. Reasonably easy.
If there are no more questions, let me thank the presenters and discussants, and also all of you for your participation.
Thank you very much.
And now it's time for lunch.